So I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Abby Rose. I'm the co-founder at viticulture. We make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. Many of you may already use or may be familiar with our tool Sector, which is our app specifically for vineyards and actually orchards as well. Sector makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health, biodiversity, and then also track vineyard activities block by block, and more. And more recently, we partnered with Nicole Masters to release the Regen dashboard. And that allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 regen indicators, as well as get tips and tricks from Nicole Masters on how to improve them. So a bit about this series. At viticulture, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And we're always exposed to amazing stuff that's happening, but not enough people get to hear about it, especially like the real implementation details of regen agriculture and viticulture. So this series is about connecting the conversations and sharing knowledge and highlighting the work of people like Chuck, who we have here today, as a brilliant resource of someone who has a lot of practical experience and knows that nitty-gritty of what it takes to take a more regenerative approach. Just a practical thing, there is a Q&A button on the Zoom webinar. So please ask any questions in that Q&A section. And then other people can upvote questions using the thumbs up button as well. So today, it's such a pleasure to be talking to Chuck Schembre. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. We first met back in, I think it was around 2017, when at the time you were working as an outreach officer for, I guess, the local conservation service. And you were kind of one of the very first people pioneering those carbon farm plans that were going to be part of a California state carbon initiative. And so at the time I interviewed you for Farmerama because you were doing a lot of very pioneering work. And almost 10 years later, I crossed paths again with you and you're still doing a lot of pioneering work. This time it was you were part of a Napa Green Regenerative Viticulture Day. And also you've just launched, actually, you're already fully into it. Your Regenerative Agronomy business, EcoSoil Solutions, after many years of offering these services with other parties. So yeah, I know, Chuck, you have an amazing amount of experience across multiple crops, including vines, and it's such a pleasure to be able to share in some of your learnings today. And so maybe we can dig right in and just start by having you share a little bit about your current role and your background and where things are at. And I know right now you're even on your farm, as far as I think, anyway. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
Thanks so much. No, it is really cool that we've reconnected, and I've been following what you've been doing as well, and I've dipped into the podcast that you've done, here and there. So it's cool that you're still doing what you've been doing and interviewing people over a decade. So I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, it's always a challenge to explain my background, but I guess I'll try to wrap that up kind of quickly. And I guess I can start in the present. Currently, I've fully launched and branded my own regenerative farm agronomy company, EcoSoil Solutions, and it's really something I've been doing for quite a long time. In fact, I've had the company as an LLC for 4 years, and I just haven't really launched it into the form in which it is now. And so it's a blessing to, get to that point. And I have a small team underneath me of some other folks and other trusted, great agronomists who are working with me. And we're working on a variety of crops around California, and a lot of apple growers, grape growers, mainly orchards right now seems to be the primary crop. And then I have quite a background in diversified vegetable systems. And so I get a lot of folks who, are small scale diversified that really are looking at the full farm ecosystem approach. And so with EcoSoil, we we get into the agronomy. We're going to dive deep into soil testing and soil health analysis, and we do SAP analysis looking at plant nutrition and make recommendations around regenerative fertility. But really at the core of it, it's focused on that ecosystem approach and implementing the soil health principles and guiding people in the transition into the regenerative systems. And then I also have a new startup farm. I live in the high desert on the Eastern Sierra on the other side of Lake Tahoe, just south of Reno in Nevada. Most people aren't too familiar about this area, but it's gorgeous. We're at almost a mile high, and I have a farm here called High Desert Harvest that's in Washoe Valley. We're at about 5,100 foot elevation, and we're really an intensive kind of market garden scale. And we're really in the startup first year. So greenhouse production, outdoor vegetables. We've got orchards going in this year and running pasture poultry. We got 200 layers that are about to hit pasture here. So yeah, I'm on and off the farm all the time and consulting, and it's fun. So it's kind of what I think I bring to folks and growers is that I have that practical background and I'm in the thick of it as well. So really trying to bridge the practical economics with regenerative is really helpful as I continue to farm. And just quickly, my background, I've been farming for over 20 years in various scales. Started, in kind of small mid-scale vegetable production in California. Organic farms was what I was most interested in. And found myself on other small diversified farms working for families, and then eventually one of the families I worked for in Sonoma County had 70 plus acres of grapes and mainly old vines, Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, and that transitioned me into understanding grapes. And then I ended up becoming a vineyard manager, farming at a fairly large scale with a company that was mainly conventional, but wanted things to be more natural. It was kind of the term. And this is in Sonoma, Napa, Mendocino County. I would rotate between those three counties, managing 7 ranches. And then that, eventually I moved into the Napa RCD as the vineyard, conservation coordinator, soil health guy. And since then I've continued to either run some sort of demonstration farm or on my own farm or consulting. So that's kind of brings me to where I'm at now. And I guess I could say I've always, I've studied a lot of things, permaculture, holistic management, and, the deep precision of agronomy. And so I sort of, integrate all of this in the work I do. And whether it's small scale or large scale, I'm always focused on the implementation of what I love to call ecological farming. We use the word regenerative a lot now, but whatever you want to call it, I think at the core it's really about farming for the ecosystem, and then the benefits we get out of that, and the resiliency of the entire farm system, from crop production, yield, and health of the farmer and the people.
Totally, all connected.
Yeah.
And just to dive into something, it is interesting in a way because a lot of people, or it's not that common to find people who have some background in agronomy who are actually applying a regenerative or ecological approach. And I just wondered if, in your experience, how much your agronomic knowledge influence or is a part of the decision making, or being able to understand what's really going on. And do you see that kind of a lack of that capability in the sector, or what are your thoughts?
But when you say agronomic, are you talking like getting?
I mean, like being able to, like, for example, understand SAP test results or soil, all that stuff that, in a way, it's the chemistry of ecology. And actually, it's maybe the most complex part of it. Or it depends where your mind is at. But for many people, I think it's the least approachable part of it. And if you're able to even start to interpret that, that seems to be a real skill set that isn't that common in my experience.
Right. Yeah, I mean, depending on the industry, there's a divide where you have the farmer, and then a lot of big farmers, they're relying on the agronomist or their local co-op, or chemical fertilized sales person, and these companies will come out, sample your soil, maybe do leaf tissue, and then tell you what you need to put out there, right? And it is, yes, for me, obviously, I'm a true hybrid where I'm a farmer, and the craft and skill of it is, for me, more important at the end of the day than the numbers on the spreadsheet of a soil test or a leaf or sap test. But we are in a phase now, I believe, with sap testing and all the different types of soil testing we can use, like the Haney test and some of the biologicals, to give us a new lens and a new understanding of how we're looking at these. The agronomics of the soil is really important. And, I don't, we can go way overboard with just looking at numbers on a soil test and then apply based on those numbers to, balance the test out, which really has led us, is part of the problem. And too much product is going out, too much nutrients are going out to the soil, and it's costing the farmer too much. And it is a slippery slope. However, I do really focus on the agronomy. And that's where I think, for me, and there's other individuals that have a different lens, and we have to still embrace this 100 years or so of understanding the science and the plant soil science interaction. And there is a place for inputs. It's important, and it depends on your soil health and the maturity of it. Sure, you can have beautiful, gorgeous soil that you farm with the principles of soil health, and maybe have all the nutrition and nutrient cycling that the plant needs. But in the transition period, that's not going to be possible. And so understanding, how do we shift away from these synthetic inputs that are causing soil disturbance and start, getting the nutrient cycling, working through the biological system, and what are those kind of inputs that we need to put in and how much. And, every site is completely different. So to your point, it is quite complex. People ask me often, can you lay down your protocols? And well, sort of, but I've got to go in with a grower and really get their context and see what's going out there and start chipping away at where I see the bad stuff that I know are causing significant issues to the soil system, but address the agronomy to make sure that we are getting the proper nutrition out there so that yields are maintained and quality of fruit is maintained. So they go really hand in hand. And I think we're just at a beautiful point now where if we manage for the ecosystem and really understand how to manage for soil health, and then we bridge what I call more advanced regenerative agronomy and balance the two. And, and I could say, I've seen people just focus on soil health and think, well, if I farm for just pure soil health, then everything's going to be great. And you've seen things go wrong. And then on the other spectrum, we know that this focusing on chemistry through the conventional agronomy approach has led us down a deep problematic rabbit hole. So it's bridging the two together and finding that balance. Yeah.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And yeah, I guess it feels like that's one of the sweet spots of what people like yourself can bring. As I say, I don't find it's not that common in my experience. So something I wanted to ask you about was cover crops in the vineyard. It's something that's much talked about. And we were discussing, that how you manage a cover crop is actually a really big part of whether you really get the benefits from it or not. And I know you were saying, like, often people think they need to mow down the cover crop at bud break because they want to make sure you have airflow, reduce moisture, prevent mildew, that kind of thing. But you said that's not your experience. So maybe you could talk a bit about how you approach managing cover crops and the value they bring from your perspective, and how you might think about that whole thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I teach on, and where my mindset has gone, is that a cover crop is, I like to use the term, it's an eco crop or an ecological crop. And what I mean by that is the cover crop is really a tool to enhance the ecosystem and the ecosystem functions. And if you want to translate that to crop production, well, if we're trying to enhance biology on the land, we have to have as much photosynthesis. If we're trying to enhance biological activity in the soil, we've got to pump as much carbon into that soil as we can, and of course, keep it covered and protected. And so, cover crops are obviously simply photosynthesizing and exuding, beautiful compounds in the soil, sugars and different carbohydrates and organic acids. And so that's one step right there. And if you're asking yourself, how do I maximize that? How do I maximize this input of root exudates? Well, you're going to have to allow these covers. You're going to have to manage them in a way where you can maximize their photosynthesis. And instead of using big words like photosynthesis, it's real simple. It's like, don't mow your cover crop too low and at the wrong time, and you got to understand a little bit more about what these species are doing. And it's just like grazing. If you overgraze the forage too low, it doesn't regrow very well, and you start getting more bare ground, throughout the time. And so, cover crop is an investment. It's a tool. And I actually don't necessarily consider it to be, this is going to sound really weird, but it's not actually a soil health practice in a sense. The practice in my mind is how you manage it. If you seed that cover crop and you're coming into bud break, and depending on where let's say sometimes in parts of California, we have bud break happening in late February, early May. Well, we're still not even close to peak photosynthesis. It's still winter. There's the degree days, the growing days aren't that long. And so mowing it too early in that part of the year, you're going to really destroy the benefit of that investment or that eco crop. And then, it's been traditional, not just in vineyards, but in a lot of other orchard systems, is to terminate that cover around bud break, because this idea that the frost level will sit, right about the height of that cover crop, and you don't have the airflow, and therefore you're more susceptible to frost damage. And I've experienced the complete opposite. And I put that to the test with vineyards that are right next to my vineyard. I've let cover crops grow right through the cordon during bud break, and we have more temperature moderation. We don't have swings occurring. And the other thing is that we used to see this a lot traditionally in California. I mean, they would start, maybe they didn't plant cover crops, but any ground covers, just terminate it, till the soil, make it bare. Well, you're going to have more diurnal temperature swings. And the soils warm up so fast. And what do you think that's going to do? It's going to trigger the plant to start pushing their sap flow and bud break even earlier. And I mean, a lot of viticulturalists have been onto this now, and it's something that I hear people talk about often. And just that getting the ground covered is obviously one of, armoring the soil is one of the greatest principles that we have in the soil health principles. But there really is no evidence at all around this idea that you have to terminate everything really low or you're going to be more susceptible to frost damage. Now, just to say, there are certain sites that may have a phenomenon that could, I know there's low spots. There are some particular orchards I've worked in where they have really hummocky or hilly topography. And we have actually noticed in some of the low spots where there is frost damage, but also that's a spot where cold air, is going to sink as well. So it's hard to say whether it was the cover crop do that or not. But you're going to get more temperature moderation, like I said. You're not going to trigger your vines to be early onset bud break, and then and there's a lot more we can discuss there. But I guess the last thing about cover crops that's really important is to understand nutrient cycling. So of course, like I said, we're enhancing soil biology. Nothing can enhance soil biology more than a living root, and the plant root exudates pumping carbon and sugars into the soil. But we're taking nutrients from the subsoil. The idea of nutrient cycling isn't just happening in the soil, right? It's moving into that plant material. Hopefully you have a diverse cover crop that can manufacture nutrients in different ways in compounds within the plant. And now, at some point you do have to terminate those covers, and you're going to do it in a way that's going to return organic matter back down to the soil from the top down. And, we're cycling nutrients now from a mineral form into an organic form in that plant material. And then cycling that back down to the topsoil to feed those topsoil organisms, continue armoring the soil, and then you just start getting in this positive, feedback loop system of nutrient cycling below ground through biological activity, and then above ground through nature's other mechanism, and that's to drop litter to the ground, whether it's an orchard or a prairie land. We got to armor the soil and build it with as much diversity of organic matter. And I guess that's just really the way to think about cover crops. And I just tend to hear that. I've just seen when people get into this, I've seen them get really worried about cover crops. So maybe they just terminated too early to be safe. But if you haven't achieved what you're trying to achieve, and that's fantastic ground cover and armor, you want that biomass to do that for you, and to get a deeper root system from the cover crop to start improving water infiltration. If you're not there yet, you got to really walk the fine line of being uncomfortable, and that's even with annual cropping systems. You have to tickle the threshold of uncomfortability until you get the repetitions in, and then you're not too, then you're not worried about it.
Totally. I like that, tickle the edge of uncomfortability. Um, okay,
Yeah.
great. So yeah, I mean, obviously cover crops is a key part of building a regenerative viticulture system and that whole ecosystem. And they have many benefits, pollinator, there's just so many benefits. And then another aspect of like the soil health principles, I guess, is the idea of not disturbing the soil. So you were talking about leaving the armor. Obviously, if people come through and till in their cover crop, that's a slightly different approach. But that transition of going from tillage to no-till in the vineyards in particular is seen as a real kind of point of no return. Well, there's this, if you don't approach it in a certain way, it can really cause a lot of devigoring of the vines. You can have serious drops in yield. And of course, that affects the bottom line. And for most businesses, that's not okay. So, but you said, what you shared with me that in your experience, it doesn't have to be that way.
Mhm.
And maybe you could talk me through a bit of, what does it look like? How would you approach that with your different clients if you were moving to no-till or maybe in the past you've done this, how do you prevent it being kind of this cliff edge?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's start with establishing no-till. And it's difficult because at times people approach it the wrong way. And let's say there's soils out there in the alleyways of the vineyard. They're basically like low use road systems, right? And vineyards actually have another phenomenon. There's a lot of foot traffic that's happening not too far from the base of the vine. There's not a lot of orchards that are like that. It's mainly tractors that the wheels stay in the tractor ruts, and I can just consider that sacrificial because the majority of the ground is not being driven over. But you think about if we've got a crew going through 5, 6, 7, 8+ times, there is actually foot traffic happening. And so the ground can be really hard, really compacted. And sometimes folks will approach it where maybe they planted a cover crop in fall. And I mean, every scenario is different. And maybe, I've seen people till up the ground when it's dry. And so they didn't really get a good disking or tillage out of it. And then they plant the cover crop in there, and it does pretty good. And again, maybe they haven't managed it for what I just explained. You got to let that biomass grow so we get root systems pumping deep to build deeper soil aggregation. And if you don't take that approach and then you just come in too early and you mow too tight or too low, and you didn't let those covers do what they're supposed to do, now what you've introduced sunlight back down the soil surface, and solar compaction is a thing. It's intense, right? Soil becomes brick, whether it's sandy or clay. So sometimes tillage is needed. And I'm in scenarios like, let's get a good cover crop out in the fall. Let's do what it needs to do. I can assess where the soil's at. And there's nothing wrong with, maybe turning that over as a green manure in the first year when the soil moisture is just right. Now, yeah, now we have bare ground, we got wind erosion, rain's going to come. There's going to be a negative effect to that tillage, but sometimes you need to use that tillage to break the ground up, and that cover crop will, feed the soil as a green manure. And then, if that was the first year of cover crops, we've gotten that benefit from those cover crops if we manage them right. And then going into fall, we can, get the right species out there and get the timing right, and have built a bit of soil aggregation to now go into a no-till system. We can also alternate the transition, like every other row could be tilled, and just if depending on the soil, if you have a really heavy clay, you're going to want to be a bit more cognizant about what the potential devigger could be. Whereas like a sandy loam soil, I tend to see no problem in a pretty rapid no-till transition. But apart from that, the other part of the question you had that's really probably the most important is, because let me just say, if you don't get your cover crop no-till right off the get-go, you've got some tools that you can work with. You could just go straight no-till, and maybe the soils are still kind of compacted and you're not getting exactly what you want, if and only if you've got the other piece happening really well. And that's now the regenerative agronomy, better nutrition, and hyper focused on that vine row soil health. So you can start, backing off the conventional herbicides or greatly reducing them, changing up the timing of them. It's traditional to strip spray right in dormancy, keep the soil bare during the winter. That's a time to rest the soil, let vegetation start populating that vine row, even if it might look ugly. You got to change your mindset. Plants, roots, fix soil, right? Dr. Rick Haney said that, and that's what we have to do. And again, we're in that transition, so the soils don't have good soil aggregation. You can't push the system to just become this beautiful vegetated carpet, because you don't have good nutrient cycling. You don't have biology doing a lot of the work for you. You're building that system so you can, sometimes it's just letting some things grow in the vine row, and then we still come back, or we come with an herbicide, but we come back later, because we're getting the soil armored and covered with a living root. And then, around bud break or just before bud break, we can use a contact herbicide. There's some decent organic herbicides out there, or maybe you've invested in in-row mowing or tillage equipment, which both have some problems behind it. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation to have, trying to bring that equipment in. And then, looking at like compost and mulches just do wonders to all perennial crops. So I always want to get some kind of application. It doesn't have to be compost. I actually prefer more woody material, because that's really what a perennial crop is going to thrive off of. Having a mixture is really good, or like a midway decomposed wood chip type product is going to be fantastic on the soil surface. It's not going to rob you from nitrogen. Doesn't work that way. That's what we've been told, but perennial crops need the carbon from woody material to feed fungi. And then we, and then the agronomy part, it comes into play. So if we get the nutrition right, and there's sometimes where I say, let's give ourselves a little bit more nutrition budget, because we're going to dip into other products that aren't the cheap bare bones. These synthetic type fertilizers are really cheap. And so if we get into we got to start integrating high carbon based products, the biostimulants, the fulvic and humic acids and hydrolysates and chelated nutrients and things like that, because those carbons, those humic and fulvics, are really powerful tools to start healing the soil around the root system, and also alleviating problems. A lot of vines, and out west, I'll sample soils in the vine row. We got fairly high pH, might have high salts or electric conductivity, you may have high chlorides from well water, and the list can go on, bicarbonates, and sometimes like extremely high phosphorus levels. Phosphorus is just locked up. That's where it's been put, year after year after year. So, we can use these carbon materials to start unlocking nutrients, or buffering pH, feeding soil organisms. And then, getting into the foliar applications is something that's important as well. And there's times where I want to pull back from the nutrient inputs to the soil, because my soil test tells me we're nutrient loaded here. And let's focus on putting biology through the drip more. Maybe we work with compost teas if we can get a good one made on site, or we purchase, high quality, trusted biological inoculants, brew on the farm, feed those organisms with sugars and humics, molasses, humics, fulvics, and start getting the biological system rocking and rolling around the vine, and move a little bit more in, or a lot more into the foliar nutrition. And that way we're not, we're trying to unlock the nutrient pool that we have down there around that root system. But if you were to just go no-till and your agronomy is not very good, like, you can get away for whatever reason. And I'm telling you this, we do not see this in other orchard crops. And I don't really know the true answer to this, and I've researched it, but vines do respond to tillage. And you till, and it introduces oxygen. There's some mineralization, CO2 is respired, and there's a release of nitrogen. And I honestly believe, well, I guess my theory on is often a lot of these systems are broken and the soils are highly compacted and they're suffocating. And you're opening that up and you're giving this release to the vine. But once you build a healthy aggregated soils around as the vine as much as we can, it's going to have that oxygen and air exchange and biological system, and you'll be just fine. But I know that probably sounds overwhelming to people who are transitioning. Oh my God, I got to do all this stuff. I got to put all this biological stuff out there. It's like, it's really not that difficult, and you can do a lot of it on farm, and a little bit can go a long way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like the way you just presented all of that, it made it really clear to me, like, that the foliar is kind of, it's a crutch for transition. Not, I mean, some foliars maybe, you keep using, but that really, like, leaning into recognizing that if you can use it as that crutch for keeping the vine healthy, let's say, whilst you're building this biological activity in tandem, that feels like a really helpful way to think about just doing the both at the same time. Because I guess if you just focus on the biologicals, you risk having the vine. That's where the devigoring comes in. You're not giving it everything it needs in the moment, and it's not yet able to access that biologically. So you,
Yeah,
yeah,
one more thing I'd add with the foliars is that we do have great nutrition and products, and products we can even make on farm that enhance plant immunity, right? Where we're driving more secondary metabolites. I focus a lot more on micronutrient management than NPK or the macros, because I know I can get that from the soil if we can do it right. But it takes way longer to get those micros corrected, because a lot of them are driven by soil fungi or specific bacterias that are going to take time to build up in the soil system. But balancing nutrition is going to increase, good improved cellular division, cell wall strength, cuticle development, and raise the bricks in the plant. And so that's where this regenerative agronomy comes in, that we're actually using nutrition as a fungicide or even insecticide. And it's really not that strange to think about. I mean, we've been using nutrients for fungal disease suppression forever, lime sulfur, copper. But so that's something that what the SAP tests really help. And the SAP test can really help in the transition. But just like any other test, you can put yourself down a deep rabbit hole if you become really hyper focused on the numbers, even on a SAP test. So I've been working with SAP for like 5 or 6 years, and I still, I just still keep learning and use it as a tool, but not the guiding. Sometimes I've been on vineyards before, and vines are unique in this way. I've been to a highly conventional vineyard that seems to be producing pretty well, doesn't have a great load of disease. Maybe it's like a Cabernet Sauvignon or something in a fairly dry area, not too susceptible to mildew and botrytis and things. And everything's bare. Everything's about as bad as I can envision it to be in a conventional farm, right? But things aren't too bad, right? So this grower's been doing some good stuff, but they want to go regenerative, and then I pull a sap test, and the whole vine is completely out of whack. I mean, it's screaming at me. I should be dead. And that's where you have to take a step back. And I guess it just takes, for someone to have a good trusted agronomist, or they collect their own data. There's, a lot of really knowledgeable, high educated viticulturalists, and they can certainly just start collecting that data and don't have to make any quick moves on it.
Mm-hmm.
Get what I call a reconnaissance. Spend year one getting data. Don't feel like you have to respond to it, and start seeing what's happening with that vine throughout the season. And then something may open up where it's like, wow, iron or zinc or manganese is just really the big outlier. And let's start there with like related organic micronutrient program there, and then see what that can do for us. Yeah.
I'd love to quickly dip into maybe just one example of the kind of things you're talking about in terms of the foliars that you could produce yourself on farm. Give one example of that, maybe.
Yeah, well, you're probably going to have to buy something, but if you're making good quality, high quality compost or a vermicompost or something like a Johnson Sioux, or just a slower, cooler, static composting system, and making teas is not that difficult. That would be part of, could go into your foliar, and then you can add some good nutrition to that. Like I said, a fulvic with whatever, if you want to get micros out there and looking for a product that's got, can be a full micro, we call micro pack, but it's chelated with organic acids, not with like some synthetic EDTA compound that is synthetic. Even though it can drive the nutrient quick into the plant, it does cause some inefficiency and stress. But we want to get high quality, organic-ish, high carbon nutrition in. Kelp, liquid seaweed, liquid kelps, in the soy hydrolysates and fish hydrolysates, proteins, lipids, fatty acids, and you can brew that. And then when you start getting familiar, at first, like the gateway into it is like, maybe you can't make your own compost tea, but you can buy a really good biological inoculant. I've got some companies I work with. I won't say it over here, but when people are working with me, I'll give them like, hey, this is where we want to go get this one. And we can brew that up, and then we can actually add these nutrients that I've just mentioned, these other, products. And we can, if you do it on site, you can actually reduce the overall rate than what the label will say, because those products are stabilized in the jug usually. So like you can buy like a really good product from a good company that say it's like we call it biostimulant, right? Say it's got hydrolysates and liquid kelp and fulvic or humic or whatever, right? We can take a fraction or a quarter or so or half of the recommended low rate. If we agitate that on site, we're actually synergizing and charging that product, and we're now creating some symbiosis with the biology if you're using a brew with biology added to it, right? And I mean, a lot of these organic products, say like double nickel, that's a fungicide. It's a biological, it's a bacteria. And so it's not really unfeasible to culture your own organisms in these teas. And then you got to feed them. You've got to feed them with sugars and proteins and organic sources. And then again, like even if you need to get potassium out there, you wouldn't want to put a lot of potassium in the brew, but let's just say you make a baseline brew and then you go to spray it out there. Then you can add in other nutrients, because you can't add too many nutrients to the brew. You could really mess up the biology that you're trying to culture. So there's a bit of a fine line there, but like I said, you can, there's just, it's hard for me to get into the exact details, but when we, you can address a lot of nutrition with foliar, whether it's calcium, potassium, vines respond really well to nitrogen foliar applications. So, and it sometimes can be much more efficient. And if we can target it at just the right time, I guess just real quick, if you think about the history of fertilizer applications, often folks will put on a lot at the beginning of the season and maybe a lot mid-season. It's like these big applications. Well, the plant's not really designed in nature to just slurp up. Like, if you eat, say 50 cheeseburgers in an annual year, if you were to try to eat 25 in January on January 1, and then 25, January 6th, midway through your annual year, I mean, or sorry, July, what did I say? January, July, you get what I'm saying? Like, it's just consuming and just pumping of, so much nutrient out in one shot is really often a waste. So the foliar allows us to spoon feed the plant a little bit more. And in conjunction, we can do that through the drip system if you're a vineyard on irrigation, because I have worked with vineyards that are in high rainfall environments that don't even have irrigation. So now, we're mainly looking at foliars in that program.
Totally. No, that was really helpful. Even just talking it through, it kind of gives me more of an idea of what's. Oh. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, no, you cut off. Yeah.
No? Okay. Yeah, I was just saying that was really helpful because it kind of lets me understand what your thinking is about what it means to create these foliars on farm and start to think through how to approach that really, because I think sometimes it's the world of biostimulants and it's just so abstract in many ways, and it's hard to kind of get to the bottom of what does it actually mean for me to do that myself or in conjunction with someone else. But the nitty gritty of it is really helpful. And we're going to get into questions in a second here. So thank you, people who've started to ask questions. And if you want to ask them, do add them to the Q&A because I will ask those in a second. But I just had one or two more questions for Chuck, specifically. Like you've done a lot of work across many different farming systems, and as you told us in the beginning, different kind of market garden style farm and orchard systems to vineyards, and then I think you work a lot with apples and pistachios and all different nuts and fruit crops. So I wanted to just dig in a little bit to, is there much overlap between those cropping systems and vines, or what can viticulturists learn from those systems, in your opinion, and what are the common threads?
Yeah. I mean, I really do truly believe the more crops you've worked with, the more your mind expands and you realize that each crop isn't so unique. Like a lot of industries get in their own bubble. And I'll just go out and say it. I mean, in the vineyard industry, it's really typical that folks only grow grapes. Whereas in other cropping systems, many farmers are growing multiple crops. Even if they grow apples, they might grow peaches and tart cherries and have asparagus and grow alfalfa. Like you'll see them growing maybe 2 or 3 or 4 things. Just particular the vineyard industry, it just depends, but like especially out west or in California, a lot of folks aren't growing something else if they're in wine country. That's just what they're completely focused on. So I think I've noticed there's sometimes this getting pigeonholed and like we're so unique, and if you haven't come from grapes, you would have no idea, and not having the exposure to the other cropping systems and what other farmers are doing, and especially in the regenerative space, because I forget who it was. There was somebody in Napa or Paso Robles who said to me, I remember who it is, but she told me that she had listened to Rick Clark, the Midwestern corn, soy, and he grows many other types of annuals. And she, digging into his mindset and what he's doing and managing for soil health really opened up her mind in the vineyard. And I thought that was really cool. And I had to go there many years ago where I was looking at the holistic grazing systems. And that's actually, I forgot to mention the cover crops, like building that ecosystem. How do I manage for optimal health across this vineyard? It's not just grapes, I'm growing a grassland. And how do I manage that within the vineyard context? So and then, just from the nutrition standpoint, and there's a lot of overlap with fruit. Like at the end of the day, fruit is fruit. They all need something specific. Pistachios require something different than almonds, but There's just something we can take. I guess that's just the basis of it. There's something we can take from every cropping system, and some industries just happen to be using a particular piece of equipment that's just become common in their region, and it can be really helpful. That can be integrated, over into a vineyard. In regards to the uniqueness of a vineyard, if you just look at all orchard systems, most orchards are fairly wide spaced. The very unique conundrum to going no-till and creating a robust ground cover in a vineyard is the vine row spacing. I mean, a lot of people have 6, 7 feet, maybe 8 feet, whereas an orchard's going to be, minimum usually 15 foot wide. And so when you're driving a tractor through a vineyard row, your tire ruts are pretty close to the vine base. And those same tractors, I mean, they're a little bit bigger in orchards, but some orchards are using pretty narrow wheelbase, and their tire tracks are really far from the base of the tree. And so we'll have like 5 or 6 feet from the tree to optimize that beautiful soil health, because who cares about the wheel ruts? I just call them sacrificial, but in vineyards, I think this is something that's unique, where we've looked at the subsoiling equipment to move it through in a no-till system every 3 years or so, just to fraction break up that deep, rut compaction. And again, that foot traffic that I had mentioned. But if you're working with, when I got into the vineyard industry, I was a vegetable grower, and as a vegetable grower, and we were using cover crops, but as a vegetable grower, and I was growing fruit as well, apples and other palm fruit, but mainly vegetables. You see all these different plant families. You're working with brassicas, and you're working with grasses and solanaceae and chenopodiaceae, beets and carrots and lettuces, and you see how plants grow. And so like when, even when I started seeing people seed cover crops in vineyards, they would just slam the seeder down, and it was off, and they weren't, calibrating it right. And it was, not really much thought. I mean, things have come a long way since that, but I just, it's understanding what other plants are doing is gonna help you in a vineyard. I've heard other people. I've met some of the best vineyard managers and viticulturists I've met are usually have a real interest in other crops, or maybe they're just like a real avid gardener, and they just have a passion for plants. And I think that just helps with the regenerative mindset, because we're managing for the whole ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to dig into some questions, because we've got some meaty questions. And I don't want them to go
Yeah.
unanswered here.
On.
No. But the first one's from Blake Mendez, and they say, I'm working at Texas University Research Vineyard in the graduate program. How do you suggest bringing up advocating for and implementing the regenerative imperative within the university landscape? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first, you want to identify what's the core problems in the industry, right? And like in Texas, there's areas that are so moist, they've got really extreme phomopsis, which is a devastating vine disease, and they're dealing with tons of diseases, downy mildew, botrytis. So, the question is, has conventional agriculture answered the question? Do we need more conventional fungicides to fix the problem? And I believe that a university really has a responsibility to look at all the solutions. And there's challenges of who is at the top of these university programs and the research stations, but there is no debate that, call it regenerative or call it ecological farming, it is a very strong solution to solving some of agricultural's most deepest problems, because you have to ask yourself, what's the core issue of this industry's problem? And the issue isn't, say, the prevalence of disease, or, well, it is the prevalence of the disease, but it's the conditions that system has created to cause that disease to become so prevalent. And it usually comes back to soil dysfunction. So that's kind of where I like to start, is like, hey, can we just, there's an angle here we should look at, and maybe as a university, we have a responsibility to look at how a true regenerative system. It's going to take quite a few years, and I forget the person's name, but know that unfortunately, a real mature functioning regenerative system may not fit within the time frame of a research project. If it's a 3-year grant, by the time it gets implemented, a year's gone by. I see sometimes just 2 years of research, and that's a challenge. If you go back to the land grant universities, they were running research well over a decade to prove things out, but things have changed in the United States since then. So trying to find long-term demonstration potential for regenerative would be important at the research station.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. And then this one is from Shannon Pike, who says, can a cover crop be managed to create a biology incubator such that you farm the cover crop to grow soil biology, and then you force the cover crop biology to migrate to the cash crop, the root rhizosphere of the cash crop, by desiccating the cover crop vegetation at specific times for the cash crop's soil biology benefit? So like maybe at vegetative establishment, pre-bloom, fruiting, pre-harvest. So I guess it's almost like, yeah. Did that make sense to you? Want me to reread any of it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that made sense. I think that's a tough sort of complex question. It is just too context based for each site, but basically like what we just talked about earlier is that we're using the cover crops to bolster soil biology. The living root, the root exudates, and diversity is really important to drive the diversity of organisms in the soil, right? The above ground diversity is going to reflect below ground diversity. And it doesn't have to be a 20 mixed species. It could be 5, 6, 7 species of a cover crop. And ideally over time, you're not seeding a cover crop. You're managing for diversity, because if you manage that ground cover without significant disturbance, mowing it too low, you're going to get perennials, you're going to get other things, latent seed that, starts taking shape. And I don't know exactly does a lagoon have an organism that will colonize and help support the vine? I don't know I don't know that, but what we do know is it is happening, and there is a symbiosis and crossover. We know that mycorrhizal fungi can connect between annual and perennials. The soil biological system, as much as we know, which is amazing, we really honestly don't know that much. And so all we can do is just manage for it, but there is an exchange occurring. And the management timing that I prefer as a starting point is try not to let the cover crops become too lignified or too mature and dried out and putting on their seed heads, because you are locking up nutrients. And if you're out west in particular, the soils are drying up, and obviously the biology starts to go a little bit more dormant across the field. You're culturing biology now in the drip zone, where the moisture's at. So getting those covers terminated while they're still green would be important. That probably means you have soil moisture. And then if you're doing that, if you're able to terminate the cover at a time where you have soil moisture, right, you're going to get a little bit more decomposition. So a little bit more release of organic material, breakdown of that cover crop. And then the really important thing is it's not necessarily just the organisms that are like right under in that top 6, 12 inches, but how about the topsoil organisms like saprophytic fungi that there's huge pathogen regulators. So, those pathogen regulators are going to play a big role in helping with potentially reducing powdery mildew and, maybe other fungal diseases, is getting as much saprophytic fungi in the system as you can. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, if you let them just go, I'll just say this is maybe someone's thinking, what about roller crimping? Well, to get a really good roller crimp, you really got to let the vegetation lignify at the stem. And now you're getting a lot of nutrient tie-up in that cover crop. Doing a proper crimp in a vineyard can be challenging, because you're probably going to be growing that well past bud break into shoot growth. And now I'm going to get a little bit worried about water and nutrient competition. I'm not ultra worried about nutrient and water competition if the system's healthy and our soils are cycling. But if we're out in the arid west, it's definitely something that is still like traditional knowledge doesn't have to be thrown away. Like we can't just grow a forest of cover crop while we're setting fruit. We're probably not gonna, we're probably gonna be challenged there if you're on drip, you know.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Sue Patrick.
Real
Oh,
quick,
sorry.
Abby, if you have for frost, you could look at using that to your advantage. And I have done that with a grower before the canopy gets real big. We've actually, turned on the frost sprinklers and get that whole field moist. That is wonderful, wonderful for managing covers and building biology. So forgot to mention that. And I'm looking at that more in orchard systems, like moving away from drip and getting more into micro sprinklers. We're seeing way better results in the overall system. Yeah.
Interesting. Hadn't heard people talk about that before, really. Okay, Sue Patrick, if someone wants to transition over to more regenerative practices, would you advocate for initially using a greater number of foliar applications to help the plants, as the soil will take a longer period of time to get into a biologically good place?
Yeah, if foliars haven't been going out traditionally, if it's been the bare bones, pre-bloom, zinc boron, and maybe there's manganese thrown out there, happens again, it's like two applications, then certainly there's a lot of room for more foliars. But if someone's already obsessively putting out foliars, I mean, there is this other spectrum of regenerative that's happening where it's like just constantly put out foliars. There's also an overkill there in my mind, and I don't. It's time, labor, and expense to go out and spray. So just want to make sure we're not, it's not just the cost as well. I'm looking at my labor and my stress on the farm. So if I'm doing 2 or 3 more sprays in the year just for the sake of foliar, and putting more strain on the human resources of labor, then maybe that's not the right choice. So, but I guess I would say generally, yes, there is more room for foliar nutrition. And because we're usually spraying for disease, that's still within the budget and the process of farming grapes. So foliars are great for grapes. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And this is from Lydia Biro. You mentioned the monoculture of vineyards. In France, they're introducing trees and hedges into vineyard plots, forestry, to manage heat and water stress. This person says they'd love to hear your comments on this.
No, I think it's fantastic. I mean, why not? And I've talked with a grower up in Oregon who's doing some demonstration on that and trying to think of like I think they call it a vitiforestry. Is that what you just said? I thought that
Yeah,
was and I definitely think, in the arid West, I see that as a really interesting opportunity to intentionally plant larger trees to cast shade across the vineyard, because grapes by nature climb trees and they're going to live within like the shade and canopy of other tree species as being a climbing vine. So I do believe that there's a place for that, and the way that design would occur is for me still unknown. I've actually thought about this a lot, and the only thing I can't wrap my head around for high quality grape growing is like the even sunlight and having, that perfect filtered sunlight we're going for color and uniformity and ripening. How do we pull off such a complex multi-canopy system, and the investment that goes into planting, say what we're at, who knows, $15,000 per acre here pretty soon with the cost of everything to get a vineyard planted, and then 2-3 years from there to get grapes, we're looking at, 30 plus $1,000 investment before we get a grape off of an acre. And to make that leap into this really, the system, it has to be done on an acre. And then I almost feel like you have to get to the point where you've got the grapes. They haven't just been harvested. Well, you'll know at harvest how uniform they are, but then you got to make wine. You got to make wine now from that vineyard to prove out that, well, this was a good choice, and I just say it's been hard for me to make those right because I am a permaculturalist and I have a food forest at home, and I just absolutely love when we can do that with orchard crops like apples or any bigger tree. Fresh market apples, they want perfect color and uniformity. They're the same thing. They've got trellis systems for it. But at the end of the day, we can, a lot of crops don't need this like perfect balance of sunlight to actually get a good product and income. Whereas with the grapes, there's another unique thing that grapes do have, right? And the way we meticulously manage it, the canopy is really unique to grape growing. So if someone figures it out, they have to write a book and then create an institute around having these vitiforests. So, but if you're just growing grapes and like table grapes, sure, can grapes grow? Yeah, you can have a beautiful system, and you have to ask yourself, what are my primary, secondary, and tertiary goals of that system? And I think you got to have your secondary has to be like another crop. There has to maybe be something else that can be harvested from that vineyard to give you a security backup in case the profitability on the grape side isn't quite where you want it to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure, as they said, it is a relatively newer area, and more learnings will come through, as you said. So it'll be great to hear from
Yeah.
people doing it. Okay, I'm conscious we're just a bit over time. I did have other questions I wanted to ask you, but I will.
I've got it depends how long you want to go
Okay,
on the
well,
podcast.
the main question I wanted to ask was just, I loved what you said, that often practitioners, will say they can't go regen. It's too risky. But actually, what you want to help people realize is that conventional ag is much riskier. And I just wanted you to explain that because I thought it was so clear how you explained that, or your thoughts on that.
Yeah, hopefully I can explain it clearly and never offend anybody. But I mean, I just feel it's pretty simple at this point. I see all crops. I get around not just the United States. I've been around the world, not everywhere, but I've heard dilemmas and major problems across so many agricultural crops. And most of those are where the devastation and catastrophe occurs is in a conventional system. And it's hard to put a conventional system in a box. Let me say, like, I've worked with growers who have never called themselves regenerative organic, and they are amazing. I mean, their land is healthy, there's a tradition that's been passed on. And so, and they don't maybe even like calling themselves conventional. Like, what does that even mean? Why are we putting everyone in the box? But if we just say conventional is a high input, high synthetic input, chemical system, that's a lot of mechanical tillage and killing and pulverizing. That's what it's come down to. There's just so many problems. The disease is getting worse. The water cycle of the soil and water holding capacity and filtration is horrible. I mean, you see something like phytophthora in orchards, and they're just pumping fungicides out there, fumigating the soils, and they're fighting this whole problem because the soils are becoming anaerobic and sitting ponded during the winter rains. But the problem is soil function. That is what needs to be fixed. And so regenerative is just such a tool. Soil health and understanding soil function is really, we just talked about what is soil function, healthy soil function. That's really the tool and the solution to almost every problem when it comes to like the land issues or the crop issues. There's other problems with economics. I have a hard time finding people that want to work on the farm for what we can pay. I mean, there's a lot of challenges in agriculture. Now fuel's up really expensive and it's difficult, but I have seen, I gave you an example, Abby, and I'll just say this, where I was down in the Imperial Valley, this is with annual crops, and I was presenting to vegetable growers. A lot of them grow leafy greens, spinach, and they grow a bunch of different crops, but mainly these spinach growers were telling me how everything I had taught at this workshop over the couple days, everything just sounded so risky. We were hanging out in the evening, sitting around a table, and it was really just farmers. It was a really nice conversation. We were having a beer, and and one of them said this to me, and I said, "Hey, so I said, I'm pretty sure when you guys, before you seed your, or when you seed your spinach, don't you guys spray a pre-emergent? I forget now if it's before or after. I think it's after they seed the spinach." And what they told me is like, yeah, so what we do is we monitor the seed as it's cracking and we time this pre-emergent spray at just the right time and another herbicide to kill everything off in the field. And if we do it at just the right time, the spinach comes up through and we've got a clean field. I said, wow, that sounds like, isn't there potentials where you mess that timing up and you kill your spinach? And they just started laughing, like, oh yeah, yeah, this happens all the time. That just happened to so and so on an 80-acre plot, and they're opening up about these things, just having complete crop failure from the poor timing or just didn't work out for them, right? And but they're farming on 3,000, 5,000, 6,000 acres, like a 40 or 80 acre field. They're like, yeah, whatever, we'll just redo it. And I just said, guys, that is risky right there, and I know that they're spraying a lot of fungicides, and um it's just, if the issue's not being solved, then we need to really ask, how do we solve this? And I think it's similar to human health, and we are at the point now where there's so many folks that have been farming regeneratively or really focused on soil health and soil function, and these aren't just made up stories. I mean, people are explaining, yes, we solved this problem and we solved that problem in this cropping system, and this is getting better. Our animals, our cattle are healthier. We have more omega balance in our beef or whatever it may be. We're seeing that connection and improving, and that's allowing us to just solve some of these problems. And I guess at the end of the day, okay, someone will ask me, well, are you telling me I will have, say apple scab, which is really bad on apples, really tough. Are you telling me we're gonna have no apple scab if we get this whole thing dialed in? I said, no. You're in a climate that proliferates apple scab. However, we can bring down the severity of it, and we can maybe solve it. Maybe you don't see any, apple blight issues. And in the case of powdery mildew, I have seen powdery mildew practically disappear on every vineyard I've worked with, that we get a good soil health system in place, because it's not a hard disease to deal with. It depends where you're at. If you're on a coastal region with Chardonnay, thin skin, tight bunch, yeah, there's context and where powdery mildew is going to be a little more challenging. But I've seen the prevalence of it completely drop out, and we are seeing there is a trend. The more conventional fungicides that are sprayed, the more the severity of the disease. And maybe the disease isn't there because you're spraying systemic and you're spraying hard contacts every 2 weeks. There's no chance for a lot of disease. But if you pull the plug, I asked the question, if you pull that vineyard off that IV system of inputs, is it going to crash? And if the answer is yes, then regenerative is a solution, because you could pull the plug on a good regenerative vineyard, and maybe mildew is just spotting up in those specific areas of the vineyard where it's a little more intense. But overall, we can really drop out. In particular, disease is really something that I see a solution.
Totally. Yeah, and I can see from your stories is just I think what seems risky or scary is like embracing the complexity, and sort of the trust. I guess there's a certain amount of trust that the system is doing the work, and that you're not controlling those few days or applying that pre-emergent and waiting for this. It's like there's a joint control with the ecology. And that's my experience anyway, or that's how I'm interpreting what you're saying. And I guess for some people, that taking that leap of sharing the control maybe feels risky, but actually, as you're just pointing out, it's much less risky because that other actor is going to help you in the times when it's difficult or you can't apply something or anything like that.
Yeah, we've created the problem like all intense nutrition or disease problems on the land in farming are man-made. And so once you have that realization, then you can solve the problem. And like I said, Phytophthora, it's a soil compaction, poor water infiltration issue. And so we created that, on the land, and now we just have to fix it. And maybe Phytophthora will spot it here and there, but it's not gonna run ravage across your orchard or, so
Yeah.
that's a
Great.
start.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck. That was really brilliant. And thank you everyone for listening and for your questions. I think, yeah, everyone loved it. Getting lots of hearts and claps. We'll send a follow-up email early next week, or maybe even this week, with the video of this recording and links to where you can find out more about what Chuck's doing and about EcoSoil Solutions. And if you want to hear more from Chuck, that's a great way to get involved. And then you can also sign up to our Regenerative Viticulture Simplified course. That gives you a 7-day deep dive in what it means to take a regenerative approach. Kind of very much aligned with that last bit of our conversation there about just the mindset shift and also some of the key indicators to help with that shift. And then to see previous episodes in the series and access the amazing practical insights from everyone who's been part of the Regen Viti series so far, you can head to the Regenerative Viticulture Hub on our website. And there's about 12 recordings at the moment. So it really is very curated sessions, just like this one with Chuck. So I encourage you to go there. Our website is vines.betacycle.com. And Lily has posted a few links in the chat if you want to go there. So thank you so much. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for taking the time out from your farm there to come say hello. And yeah, we really appreciate it. And we're excited to follow the EcoSoil Solutions journey and your farm journey as we go on.